Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm once again taking you beyond the board with a special guest. This time it is my very good friend and fellow Roman history enthusiast, although we'll talk details on that, Morgane Gouyon-Rety. How are you doing, Morgane?
Hey Liz, how are you? I'm good. I'm good. I'm very happy to be here with you today.
I'm happy to have you. So, we are going to do a double header. This first episode is going to just be about Roman and ancient themed games. And then our next episode is going to be about Morgane's next game, which is going to be Hubris. So stay tuned for that. But Morgane, you particularly like games with ancient themes. What are your favorites in that genre?
Generally speaking, I mean, I like everything which has both political and strategic dimensions. So, I mean, I probably started the biggest game I played were like Imperium Romanum, second edition, and Republic of Rome, which is the most excellent game. These were probably the best I can remember. I mean, I played a lot of them. I'm not too keen on the tactical games, especially since I found most of them to be not that faithful to history, in my opinion. But I mean, obviously, the whole SPQR Alexander of the Great Battles of History is good, but I probably have all of them, at least for the ancients. But yeah, I'm much more of a megalomaniac type. I like to to play it at the grand scale. So, and then later on, I mean, there were some excellent games which came out, like in particular Successors, which originally came with Avalon Hill and then was taken again by GMT. That must have been, it was definitely a favorite of my gaming group when I was like just out of engineering school. So we played that one to death and beyond, I guess. Also because the theme is one which is very close to our heart. What other games? For some reason, I discovered Hannibal versus Rome from Mark Simonich fairly late. So I mean, I played it fairly later. Um, but yeah, plenty of other games. Peloponnesian War is a good one.
You are very interested in historical accuracy in your ancient games. What games, other than your own, such as Pendragon and Hubris, would you say are very accurate and really work for you on that level?
Right. And I will not name names, but there's been so many games which are definitely not accurate, which are like cartoon like take on ancient history with like more of a sandbox on which historical names are plastered. These may be fun, for a minute, but that's not what I'm looking for. I'm really looking for something where I can feel I am placed in the shoes of the historical persons and faced with the dilemma that they faced. So, and then it's a question about the model you use. I mean, what are you trying to model? I mean, if you take Imperium Romanum 2, for instance, second edition, as far as modeling the wars at the operational or military level, the rivalries between would-be emperors, it's pretty good. There are some issues, or there were some issues in the second edition with things just like supply and how some independent units could behave. But generally speaking, I mean, it did give a fairly good depiction of the key features of a Roman civil war. However, if you try to push that model to represent conflicts with non-Roman powers, well, the model was stretched a little bit too far beyond what it could do. Um, Successors, on the other hand, I mean, there is a sandbox element, but you might say that this whole period had a sandbox element. And I think it does capture a great lot of what were the key features and constraints and decision points that the historical successors faced in real life. So I mean, there's some things which are missing, in my opinion, something which could be a bit more emphasized, but then it's more a matter of point of view. I mean, there is no question that this game does a fairly good job of representing the situation and the choices that these people had to make. So yeah, there's that. Republic of Rome is excellent, I think, in that regard. It is a very deep experience. Again, if you're looking at what it was like to be one of the leading, senators or families in Republican Rome, I know that there has been some attempt to port that system to some other systems. I think there was one done on Carthage, which, from what I heard, was not that successful. So, it's always a matter of having the model you're using and your subject matter and what you're trying to highlight in concordance.
Makes sense. I still need to play Republic of Rome. I need to get on that. So the other thing I've noticed about your taste, especially as a designer, is that you love
Mhm.
the ancient world, but you are not necessarily a great lover of Rome itself.
That's fair to say. Well, yes. I mean, the obviously you cannot ignore Rome whenever you talk ancient history, at least in the second part of it. But then, there's many people have this sort of fascination for Rome. I mean, they won after all. But there's also a lot of things for which they, in my opinion, I mean, are to be blamed for. And it so happens that part of, I guess, my personal history, my personal interest, I tended to developed very, very young, big fascination for everything which had to do with ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, the ancient Celts, all enemies of Rome. And all of them were at some point crushed or absorbed or enslaved or raped or whatever you want to name it by Rome. Just to take probably the more the example closer to my heart. I mean, I'm French and I have Celtic origins, so it's hard for me to ignore that Caesar I mean, built his reputation and his power on basically waging an illegal war on the Gauls and raping and burning and murdering his way through a country which was at the time no threat to Rome, which was much more civilized and advanced that we tend to think, in large part due to the propaganda of Caesar himself, and ended up with, I mean, it's estimated that there were about 1 million Gauls who lost their lives as a result of Caesar's campaigns, another million which was carried off into slavery to Italy, representing something like a quarter of the total population. so, so right, I mean, something came from that. I mean, the Gallo-Roman civilization from which ultimately the French culture came. I mean, obviously, could not have been what it is without the Roman element. But not everything is positive with Rome. I mean, especially if you like the Celts. I mean, there is a very long history of war and fear and massacres ultimately between the Romans and the Celts. I mean, and so yeah, it's hard for me not to see the Romans are the bad guys.
Okay, so I'm a Latin teacher. Obviously, I really enjoy Roman history, Roman literature, but you're also not wrong. The fact is that Julius Caesar has these qualities that make him interesting, very nervy, very gutsy, does a lot of really bold and impressive things throughout his life, but he also was definitely an unapologetic mass murderer and
Mm,
not a very nice person. The other thing that makes it hard, I think, to make games that are Roman era but that aren't focused on Rome is that so much of the literature that we have is either by Romans or very much focused on Romans. You even have Greek historians writing about Rome at the time. So how do you try to access other angles, other voices, and bring non-Roman ancient cultures to life, the ones that were in that same time period?
Right, that's an excellent point, Liz. I mean, especially when you are dealing with culture which were basically not using, the written form that much, like the ancient Celts. Pretty much everything we know or used to know about them comes from Rome or marginally from the Greeks. So, fortunately, I mean, there's been a lot of information, so you can actually cross-reference, get some information from that, and then archaeology has helped a lot in fleshing out, everything we know. Uh, but uh, but for just give you a quick example, staying with Caesar in Gaul, it is a common, I would say, thinking that Gaul has no cities and no roads and had very little agriculture. Um, Now we've got a number of historians who've actually used Caesar's text to show that, when he refers some of the oppida of the Gauls, when he refers just how big an armies could be supplied from this place and from these lands. Obviously, this was not all forest, and when you look at like the marching rates of Caesar's army, that again could not have been achieved without roads. So there were roads. They may not have been, the extremely well engineered Roman roads that we all know of, but there were definitely good serviceable roads, which are, by the way, alluded to in other sources. And then archaeology has confirmed a lot of that. I mean, it's amazing, especially now. I mean, when we have all these methods with aerial pictures and stuff. I mean, we know today that before the Roman conquest, gold was actually extensively cultivated and had large farms, and actually what we think today as Roman villae, actually the precursors were gold, and there were roads, etc. So all of that, thankfully, is coming to light nowadays because we have access to more information, and also because we have some new, I would say, approaches which are now being considered. I mean, with most historians today will not slavishly just believe what Caesar had to say. I mean, they understand he has an agenda. We understand he had some particular tropes that he wanted to use in order to talk to his public, which was a Roman public. So that's how you get to it. If you deal now with like the Eastern Mediterranean, thankfully there are more independent sources. Some of them are pro-Roman, but again, I mean, you have just enough that you can reconstruct a lot of what happened in the Greek world, in the Hellenistic world, prior to the Roman conquest.
So the other thing I find interesting about games with ancient theming, and I think you do too, given that you're currently designing Hubris, which we'll get to, is that we have a lot of games that are kind of about the classical Roman period, like that
Mm,
really sweet spot as the Republic turns into empire and kind of in there. But we don't have a lot of late Roman games, with the exception of things like Wars of Marcus Aurelius. We also don't have, I mean, there are some games that are about Greece before Rome's a big deal. You know, we have games about the Peloponnesian Wars, we have games about Alexander,
mm.
but are there any good games about ancient Egypt or Persia that aren't centered so much on our obsession with Rome or with say Alexander?
Well, there is another period where you have a lot of games, and that's the Second Punic War. You do have quite a lot of games focusing on this. I mean, it was a tremendous struggle, obviously, between Hannibal and Rome, and you can understand, I mean, why it was so pivotal in that this was probably the last time before the late Roman Empire that Rome itself was, at a significant threat from an external enemy. But But there's a ton of games on the Second Punic War. And while I do appreciate gaming this period, if only because I get to ravage Italy and threaten Rome, but it's it's a little bit like all the Bulge games or the Waterloo games about. I mean, it's just too many of them. But you're right. I mean, if you really go away from the classical Roman subjects, you don't have that many, or you have again very high level games which sometimes have more to do with being a game than being an historical simulation. There have been some attempts which I'm not that familiar with to portray things like God Kings, which I think is Compass, like Genesis with GMT games, which try to focus on the heights of the Babylonian and Persian and new empire, new kingdom, Egypt, that sort of thing, the Hittites. But there's not that many, and they tend to be more of a satellite view. And part of it may simply be because we have very little detailed information. So these may be very interesting subjects, but it's hard to design a game when you have not much information, or if that subject matter is so little known in the general public that there might not be much interest having a game about it. So that's probably one of our challenges as designers is to sort of lose interest, going beyond the few things about ancients that are well known.
So, what are some themes that you think have a lot of possibility from the ancient world that haven't been done yet?
Right. So there's probably quite a few, but then we all have our own, preferred preferred periods and preferred subject matters. One of mine, obviously, is the Hellenistic world. I'm absolutely fascinated by this period, which extends from the death of Alexander to the conquest by Rome of the Eastern Mediterranean. Um, I think it's a fascinating period, not only for the clash of kingdoms and ambitions and hegemonies, but also because it's my opinion, it was actually where the classic Greco-Roman civilization was born. It was very much the advances from that period, which were then taken over and made, into a Mediterranean worldwide civilization by the Romans. So obviously, I mean, I've been dealing with that period. I mean, hubris is part of that, and I have some other projects which are part of that. But there are other subjects. I mean, Carthage is a very interesting subject matter. I mean, if you consider it, how one city managed to build, using very different mechanism than Rome, to build this large empire, relying mostly on trade and that sort of thing. The various clashes between, I would say, the Greeks, whether and Carthage on the one hand, and the Persians on the other hand, whether in Sicily, whether in Asia Minor, in my opinion, are not entirely depicted. I mean, for instance, you will find a lot of games on individual battles of the Medic Wars, the wars between Greece and Persia. Um, but as far as I'm aware, there's no good game about the actual wars, or no good games about the actual conflict as seen from, again, a strategical, political, cultural point of view. So these are subjects which are only looked at from a very narrow lens of individual battles, which, in my opinion, would be very interesting. I mean, the rise of Persia would be a good game. I think Genesis kind of touches on it, but there's a lot of subjects which have not been explored. Um, we could go into the Celtic world. I mean, the Celtic. Some people talk of Celtic Empire, which is not right because it was never unified. But I mean, they did rule and they did spread over a huge territory. I mean, there will be a ton of good stuff to be done with that. And then you mentioned the late Roman Empire. I mean, we're starting to see a few games dealing with that. You mentioned the wars of Marcus Aurelius, which is not quite late Roman Empire, more like
It's still
middle.
late for what we normally get. Still a code. Now we're talking.
Yeah, now we've got Stilicho coming, which I'm really looking forward to. We had, there's this game, Invasions, which recently came out. Unfortunately, the material is sumptuous. The game itself is not finished, in my opinion, but maybe someday we will be able to play it. Um, and Dragon, to some extent, was a little bit of that. I mean, so yes, I think we're starting to see some of that in a field where, for a long time, the only games we had were Britannia, and then some. There were a couple of spin-offs from Britannia, including one. I don't know if you ever heard of it, which was by a French company, which was called Hispania, which was the same thing as Britannia for Spain and Portugal,
Hmm.
which was actually a very good game. And I think I mean, I know of Maharaja and Italia. Obviously, Maharaja has nothing to do with ancient Rome, but it's still ancient. I mean, it starts with ancient India, which was quite interesting
Yeah.
as well. I know next to nothing about. I'm very much European, I guess, in this regard. I mean, I know next to nothing of the ancient history of India, but on China and Japan and Korea, I mean, I know enough that I know there is some interesting material there, but certainly not enough to dare uh, go into that sort of field. But yeah, I mean, the foundation stories of China, the Seven Kingdoms, or whatever. I mean, there seems to be a lot of interesting stuff there as well.
Yeah, I
But,
mean, the world is wide and the history is deep for sure. One thing I've also wondered about, so I don't know, I'm not a game designer. I just play other people's games and judge them. But I,
fine, fine.
so I would love one thing that we don't get in my opinion enough with games about the ancient world is games that are less about war and more about some other aspect of ancient life. And I know that you're not a big Romans person, but I am a big fan of several sort of conniving Roman women, such as, Livia, wife of Augustus, or Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, or the Julias under the Severan dynasty. And I think that there's so many possibilities to have interesting women, interesting people who weren't, living the first parts of their lives in Italy. You could have less Italo-centric games. You know, I feel like there's so much room for themes about ancient subjects that aren't war. Is that something that interests you, or do you consider yourself a war gamer?
No, I mean, I'm always wary with this term of war game because I think it's a little bit restrictive. As I mentioned, I mean, I like my games to bring together the various aspects, the military, the economic, the political, the cultural, religious, if relevant. Um, but you're right. I mean, there's also room for, especially on the political side. I mean, obviously, Clausewitz was not an ancient, but the thing about the continuity between war and politics is, I mean, it wasn't new in the 19th century. I mean, it's always been a dimension. So, in this respect, the Republic of Rome is a most excellent game because it's first and foremost a political game. There's intrigue, there's war, but it's the key of it is what happens in the Senate with the various blocks of senators trying to pass legislation which will, advance their own agendas. Like, for instance, there's a number of wars which threaten the republic, but these wars are both threats and opportunities, which is a very Roman thing. Not only Roman. Um, And so deciding who you are going to appoint to lead this campaign, and who's good enough, but who might gain undue advantage in terms of fame and prestige and followers, etc., as a result of the war. I mean, all of these dimensions are present in the game and make for a very, very complex but very interesting game. And as you go into the middle to the late Republic, the internal dimensions take a bigger and bigger share of the event. I mean, you have to deal with the plebs, which is asking for land reform, for instance, and you may want to support their claims, or you may want to block them, and that becomes a big, a big stake into senatorial politics. So yes, I mean you could definitely have a ton of interesting game, which would be less war and more of the other dimensions, and you could get to a more personal level. I think Republic of Rome does have individual persons to a large extent, but you could go deeper. I mean, you mentioned some famous ladies of the Julio-Claudian or Severan, etc. But uh, to a large extent, the internal politics of the imperial family throughout the empire would certainly make for a good game if you manage to capture it in a manageable way. Um, yeah, I'm sure there would be some game material here.
So, speaking of game material, let's whet everyone's appetite for our next episode. Your game that we're going to be talking about next week, Hubris, is set in the Hellenistic period. What attracts you to the Hellenistic period? Why make a game about it? What is compelling about this time for you?
Yes, so the first thing is that as the name, which has been coined to brand it, so Hellenistic, that's like the epitome of the Greek culture and civilization. So since I'm a big fan, that's one thing, and then that's when they actually go and meet and merge or integrate a lot of aspects from other civilization, because as a result of Alexander's campaigns, the Macedonians and the Greeks got not only in contact but actually got to manage on a daily basis such ancient civilizations as the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, Lydians, Persians, etc. So from that was brought an incredibly fascinating merging of information and knowledge and beliefs, from which a lot of science came from that, a lot of philosophical advances came from that, a lot of religious opinions, I will not call them advances, came from that. So it's a fascinating period, which, in my opinion, is absolutely key to what our current civilization is. And then on a strategical and political aspect, this is a period of rivalry between kings, which were very similar. I mean, they all came from, the companions of Alexander. They were all coming from leading families in Macedon. So they all shared the same cultural basis and the same experience, and so to a large extent the same worldviews. Obviously, there were some specificities due to where they actually ruled, but and they went at it, and they went at it for a couple of centuries because when you were the heirs to Alexander, there was nothing less than total hegemony, which would be satisfying. So it makes for a very interesting situation in that there's not basically there's very little ideology, there's very little racial conflicts or whatever. It was really pure personal ambition, naked power, and just trying to maximize what you had and come ahead. So And then we do have quite a bit of information because we are so close to the Roman period, I guess. There's a lot of greater than life characters which come out from this period. I mean, Alexander is one of them, but there's many others, including a few women, which are interesting. So yeah, it's always been a period which has fascinated me, and where I've always thought like there's a ton of material to make great games.
Fantastic. So we'll be talking about one of those great games, Hubris, which is development next episode. Thank you so much, Morgane, for coming on, for having this conversation with me. We really appreciate you.
Well, so it was my pleasure, Liz.
All right, we will be talking to y'all again next week, everybody. Thanks for listening and happy gaming.